reasons to read the Bible. The majority of us very familiar with the Bible, but it doesn't do us any harm to be reminded of just how unique this book is. It contains so many unique properties that can't be attributed to any other piece of literature that's ever been written or published. It's a phenomenal thing, and that's why so many people down the ages have made the decision to base their life upon its contents. So we're going to be focusing upon some of these aspects, and specifically we're going to be looking at some of the statistics about the Bible as a piece of publication, the Bible story itself, a couple of characteristics about Israel, the phenomenon of childbirth, language, distribution of the Bible itself, its reach into the world, and human spirituality. So we're just looking at those characteristics relating to any specific doctrine or specific lesson from the Bible itself tonight. So focusing on this book then that we've all hopefully got in front of us and hopefully got open, the Bible, of course, out of all of the choices that could have been made of what would be published first on the form of ink on the page, is of course the Bible. The Gutenberg Bible, there's a picture of a Gutenberg Bible published in 1455. It's the first book that was ever printed. Why? Because to print was quicker than to write, and therefore the ability to disperse the Bible to a greater number of readers, or of the means of publication through printing, the Bible was chosen for that means. People needed to have a copy of the Bible. It was more important than any other work that had ever been written, and so the Bible was chosen first. No coincidence, we'd say, because the Bible has been placed into the hands of human beings so that they might come to know God. And it doesn't matter how much effort people try to remove the Bible from society, it will never be taken away, as we'll see looking at some of the stats. So when we think about the society we live in today, it's very clear to us that we increasingly live in an age which becomes less religious and less inclined to believe in God, certainly less inclined to be devoted to following a path of life that's based upon Bible principles. We've got some data there on the screen that informs us that in research undertaken in 2017 that, we can see the stories broadly similar across those European nations. But if we look at the United Kingdom at the bottom, we can see that 73% of people in total would classify themselves as non-practicing Christians or church-attending Christians. And over time, when you look at the trend of this, the non-practicing element is reducing, but more starkly, the church-attending Christians of 18% in 2017 is also significantly always on a decreasing downward trend. And in fact, to be part of that 18%, you simply had to be somebody that attended some form of church or gathering once a month. And that could be any denomination under the broad title of Christianity. So the Bible was the first book to be published, but we have declining interest in terms of people's attendance. We've got declining Bible knowledge as provided in the last Bible Society questionnaire that was undertaken, run by Gallup, so independently run. If anybody knows Gallup, they are a serious player in the field of gathering independent opinion, and we can see on the data there that there was very, very limited knowledge of the Bible and its contents. We can see that some of the most basic stories in the Bible weren't understood to be derived from the Bible at source. 31% David and Goliath, 30% Adam and Eve, 23% of 8 to 15-year-olds had never read, seen, or heard of Noah's Ark. We're only going to go back sort of 25 years, probably for the majority of people, perhaps some sort of my age when we were at school, that we were still taught these stories, and that is disappeared from society. And so it's interesting to think about that whilst a long time ago the Bible might have been chosen as the most important book to have printed, there's declining interest in terms of attendance, there's declining knowledge because no one reads it, and yet it's still significantly the most popular book that's bought. This is a particularly interesting chart because it was published in Newsweek in 2019. It's obviously Newsweek is one of the largest published titles in the world, and what's interesting about this from the previous 50 years, I find it really interesting that the Quran's not on there, but notwithstanding that, is that the information here in the millions, so we can see, Harry Potter, the third most popular book, sold 400 million copies, and then you've got the essential communist manual of China, that's second, 820 million, and the Bible 3.9 billion. This is over the period of 50 years, up to 2019, and interestingly, this isn't the number of books printed, but this is the number of books sold. And so you just reflect upon just the volume of copies of the Bible sold, 3.9 billion over the last 50 years. And yet that's accompanied by the reality that people are less inclined to physically attend church. That's clearly been more challenging in the last 12 months, 15 months to physically attend, but you understand the point. And people don't understand it. So that is an anomalous point, that something continues to be sold in such significant numbers, whilst the interest actually in its contents is a declining thing. And yet the movement to ensure that all corners of the globe have access to a Bible continues. This is taken from wycliffe.org, as you can see. And we can see there, 1,548 languages have the complete New Testament. 1,138 languages have some portions of the Bible. 2,617 languages have active translation work. That takes us to about 5,300 languages in total. And there's about 6,500 languages, different dialects across the globe. And so it's a work that's ongoing, that the Bible, the endeavor that the Bible should be accessible to all peoples. So it's anomalous work to make sure it's translated. Work is effort is ultimately paid for. The book continues to still outsell whatever else is published, as we can see. And yet, against a backdrop, declining attendance, declining knowledge. The Bible will never be removed from society. God's voice will always be there. But it's there to be read, and so it should be a part of everybody's lives. Because the Bible story is an amazing story. It's a phenomenal story. Now, I've just got written just in short paragraphs of the books of the Old Testament, because the Bible story is unlike any other. Just at a simplistic level, without considering the complicated or the multifaceted way in which God communicates to us through the Bible in different forms of writing and expression. But the story itself is so grand, it's so sweeping, and yet it is all based on a pattern. And it's based upon a pattern that we recognize in the world that we see today. So, for example, when we see Genesis introduces us to the concept of a problem, and the problem is something called sin, and sin is something that results in death and all sorts of different challenge. The practical realities is of looking out the window at everyday life, but there is a solution to that problem, and that's what Genesis introduces us to right at the outset in Genesis chapter 3. And it tells us that there are essentially two types of people. They flow from a man called Abel and a man called Cain. And that there would always be a way for those that believed God, and a significant proportion of people, the Bible tells us, wouldn't be interested in the things of God. And that always throughout, a principle that God has in society through sin is that you reap what you sow. And there is a consequence to sin, and sin continues to work its work. And so that journey is taken forward from Cain and Abel, that there's the problem of sin. There are the two peoples, Cain and Abel, and those peoples are forcibly separated when Israel, that descend from a man called Abraham, are separated from Egypt through their faith that the blood of an innocent lamb could save them from death, foreshadowing Jesus. And they're then taken onto a journey to the promised land, which in pattern shows the journey, a journey to the promised land, or the kingdom of God. And then on reaching the promised land, there's a man called Joshua in the book of Joshua, and he in type shows the work of Jesus at his first coming, in that Jesus would overcome sin. Joshua would overcome the significant threat of the peoples derived from Cain to Israel being in that land, but that there was still some work left to do. And that work was not completed in the book of the Judges, which is the next book in the Bible. And Judges shows us that after Joshua had died, or after Jesus had died, after his first advent, that people were left to continue with that same mission. Joshua had established 24 elders over the people to be able to have structure, so that they might be able to live in such a way that they could overcome the problems of sin. That's not what happened in Judges. The whole thing fell apart, and it resulted in a dark period. Got listed there: immorality, death, disease, war, famine, violence, and all sorts of different forms of cruelty. It showed the natural repercussions for sin, for Israel. But Judges is also about, after Jesus had died, there would be a darkness in the earth, where those same problems of immorality, death, disease, war, famine, violence and cruelty would characterize man's experience on the earth. And so for the last 2,000 years, we've effectively lived in a period foreshadowed by the book of Judges. And then God shows in the experience of Israel what we can expect to happen, because in the books of Samuel and Kings, kings are raised through a man called David and a man called Solomon. The man called David would overcome in establishing Jerusalem as the capital, and he would do so through warfare. And Solomon would introduce the worship to God through peace, and the kingdom would be established. And the twofold work of David and Solomon speaks about the work of Jesus Christ when he will return. And then finally, the end of the story of the Old Testament in Ezra and Nehemiah shows that in ignoring the will of God, through having self-government across the entire world, leads to captivity of sin. And the whole world is imprisoned in captivity of sin. But that one day, says the story of Ezra and Nehemiah, in the actual history of Israel, foreshadows that there will be in Jerusalem, the city of peace, the center point of a kingdom which will fill this earth, and Jesus Christ will be imposed as righteous king, who at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah was foreshadowed in the king-priest role of Joshua and Zerubbabel. And there's so much in Scripture that underpins this grand sweeping story that effectively encapsulates in Israel's history, and through the prophetic word and the development of the truth from the time of Christ, to enable us to understand our context in the history of the world and in God's purpose. And Israel are critical to this. The Bible is very clear that whilst they were a people that weren't going to commit to God in the way that God required, and that God's unfolding purpose would eventually involve all humanity, the Jews are witnesses to God's purpose. Isaiah 43 verse 10 says, "You're my witnesses, says the Lord, my servant whom I've chosen, that you may know and believe and understand that I am God." You'll be in astonishment, says Deuteronomy chapter 28, a proverb, a byword among all nations, whither the Lord shall lead thee. Psalm 44 corroborates and says, "Thou makest us a byword among the nations, a shaking of the head among the people." And that's exactly what the Jews have been. Speak to any anthropologist worth their salt. Speak to any academic that works in the field of migration flows and the development of nation states over time, and they will tell you that just like the Bible as a work of literature, the Jews are, as a people, anomalous. There are characteristics attributed to them that can't be attributed to other peoples. They are a source of contention in the world, and always have been. We see that they continue to be today in the Middle East. The slightest thing has to happen in Israel and it's on the news. It is there as a witness. And the Jews over time were going to be characterized by two relevant aspects. And it would be the fact that is in Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 62 says, "As they wander the world," and the wandering Jew is, until relatively recently, has been a phrase that people would understand and recognize. They would be left few in number, we're told, is one characteristic. And when we look at this graph, what we see there when we chart the red line is that the Jews, until the last century, remained remarkably static in their populace. There've never been many of them. They've just existed as a witness, as the Bible says. We're also told about the land itself, that just as the people would remain few in number, so the land which they were brought into, and we're told in the Bible it was a land flowing with milk and honey, and we have lots of language to describe the greenery, the trees, the vegetation, that this was a land that was, agriculturally speaking, a beautiful place to live. But we're told that just as the people will remain few in number throughout their time away from the land, which is a matter of historical record, that the land would become desolate. Leviticus 26 verse 32 says, "I'll bring the land into desolation." Zechariah 7 verse 14 is equally as clear. The land was desolate after them. They laid the pleasant land desolate. I just got on there from just a few words from the book Mark Twain, The Innocents Abroad, published in 1867. But he's really clear that the land's awful. It's dreary. There's nothing that grows there. Over its broods the spell of a curse that has withered its fields and fettered its energies. And just as the number of Jews in terms of their population across the world has increased, leading up to the time when they returned back to their land in the second half of the last century, notwithstanding the impact of World War II on them. Similarly, the land has responded to agricultural means. And Ezekiel chapter 36 tells us that the land that was beautiful and became desolate will again become beautiful. And we see the early signs of that process taking place also. So I've got there some words on the screen from the International Embassy in Jerusalem from May 2019. And it tells us that Israel, it's leading the way in agricultural innovations and water conservation. It's pioneered drip irrigation and currently recycles over 80% of its wastewater, far outstripping any other nation. And so it says, whilst over half of its land is still arid desert, Israel exports high quality farm produce in all seasons, while its neighbours must import food to feed their populations. And so again, the land is anomalous in its context. It doesn't grow surrounding Israel, but now it seems to. And having been to Israel, I can vouch for the fact that you can drive through the desert, and such is their leading innovations in irrigation, that there's literally greenery sprouting out in the desert, just green fields where in the middle of sand. And so the bottom paragraph reads that yet the land of Israel was not always so fruitful, and the Jewish people certainly were not known for having a green thumb. In fact, the land lay desolate for all the centuries of Jewish exile, confirming what the Bible told us would happen. And in both Christian and Muslim lands where the Jews were dispersed, they were largely forbidden from owning land. This meant they basically lost the ability to farm and had to rely on the Gentiles to feed them. And so this, as I say, from the International Embassy, it's making the point that it's so remarkable that when the skill of agriculture had been stripped from the Jews en masse, that the land and the skill set should so quickly come into play from coming into the land less than 100 years ago. So next we'll think about childbirth. We've focused upon the Bible as a publication, the fact that it's not read, not understood, but by at least 8 to 1. And we've considered the fact that the Bible story is such a unique one that it's worthy of being read. The characteristics of the nation of Israel and the Jewish people are anomalous in the world. And next we think about childbirth. The Bible is very clear that childbirth for humans will, in general, be a problematic experience. Genesis chapter 3 verse 15 promises the solution to sin. I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed, it shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. And it's talking about the two lines of people that would come from Cain and Abel, effectively. But it's telling us that the seed of the woman would bring salvation. But Genesis 3 verse 16 says that for the woman I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. I'll greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. And then in Timothy we read, notwithstanding the woman shall be saved in childbearing. Why? Because the birth of the child, as prophesied specifically in Isaiah chapter 7, Jesus Christ, would bring salvation. He would be that promised seed of the line of Abel in the Bible story. And so we ask ourselves the question, well, there we're told that the pregnancy is going to be a problem. It's going to be a woman's sorrow and the conception. And so from Bible principles alone, we're told that the challenge of childbearing is part of the curse. It's part of sin. We're told it's also the means by which salvation will be provided. We're told that every time a child is born, it reminds us that sin is the worst disease. At best, it brings significant discomfort. At worst, it brings death. Other mammals don't experience this issue with childbirth. Not just with childbirth, but also the menstrual cycle. The frequency with which a woman has the potential to conceive is not experienced in the mammalian population. And lastly, the point that I've got there at the bottom is that every time a child is born through this process, for those that believe and trust in God, they're reminded that life's not a given. Life's not a right. Life's a gift. It's not something that is to be expected or assumed. Similarly with salvation. And that's what natural birth is foreshadowing in that sense. It's precious. Life is precious. It should provoke thankfulness and a desire to follow God's salvation. And we can gaze across the world through various media, through the lens of media, and we can all observe that human beings do not always treat life as a precious thing. unless it directly impacts their own selves. And so it's interesting when we look at childbirth, and particularly in recent academic research concerning the obstetrical dilemma. And the obstetrical dilemma is essentially an argument that says that childbirth has to be difficult for humans because the size of a woman's pelvis can only be so wide in order for them to be able to walk upright and to move. And so effectively evolution, says the obstetrical dilemma, has provided a compromise that allows the woman to walk upright and also to deliver a child. And this is understood on basic recent research not to be the case. Research was undertaken at Harvard University in 2014, looking at the obstetrical dilemma. Was it actually true? You can see there, you can see that, that lovely, vulnerable newborn babe on the left, and you can see the lovely but not as vulnerable on the right being born, because so many mammals, as we know, when they're born, immediately can start to walk around the field and be independent and feed themselves. With humans, that's not the case. Equally with humans, the brain of the human is so significantly advanced in terms of its size than mammals when they are born, and yet the human's body is not. It's a confusing thing for evolutionists as to why that process wouldn't keep pace, that the body is out of sync with the mind. But the simple fact is that humans are the most vulnerable of all species when they're born, and they require much more input, support and constant care in their early formative stages. To Bible believers, it's really clear that those early formative stages, and in the first 18 months, and to scientists, particularly neuroscientists, it's really clear that in the first 18 months of a baby's life, their entire character is formed, and their ways, their neural pathways, those neural networks that are developed through those very early experiences, principally between mother and child, hearkening back to Genesis 3:16, they form the way the child will cope and respond to life. Not so with animals. Anyway, just to reflect upon this for a moment, we're told, and this is taken comments from an article on the BBC, the real reasons why childbirth is so painful and dangerous. And even now today, it's staggering to contemplate that 830 women die every day because of complications to do with childbirth. Almost 1,000 people a day across the world. And births result in so many long-standing, life-changing injuries. And as we read at the bottom there, we read those last words. It's not to mention the untold numbers of children lost during pregnancy and childbirth. From an evolutionary perspective, those numbers are just not normal. Why for humans is pregnancy and childbirth so difficult? Well, unless you're looking at Genesis chapter 3 and verse 16, there is no obvious answer. We are the highest form of species on the earth, to use evolutionist terminology. It stands to reason that in being the fittest of the species, we should be a little bit better prepared in those most early experiences of actually giving birth to life. Now, these are some closing words from the quote of the research that was undertaken at Harvard University, which says that the take-home message is that until recently, the maternal pelvis was well adapted for both its locomotor, that's the walking, the ability to stand upright and move function, and for giving birth. Natural selection demands that public reproduction work. And she concludes on the third line from the bottom, what we really need is better data on birth outcomes and infant size in hunter-gatherer populations, whose lifestyles are probably a better reflection of the conditions we evolved to deal with. That's a dissertation for someone else. And so what we're being told is that the research undertaken and published in 2014 at Harvard concluded that the size of the maternal pelvis does not need to be the size it's at in order to be able to walk and move and function in the upright positions as humans do. That the correlation doesn't exist, and that the pelvis can comfortably be bigger to enable the size of the baby's head to pass through comfortably in delivering at the stage of birth and not impact the movement of the woman. And so it's interesting, she concludes that, you know, in terms of being able to understand why this would be, why birthing therefore is such a problem, that's a dissertation for someone else, because the data doesn't exist. And the data doesn't exist because the truth of the matter is that it relates to sin. When we think about language, this is equally as confounding to any field of academia. So we read in Genesis chapter 11 that there was a time when there was one language spoken upon the earth. And that, for reasons as we find in Genesis chapter 11, which we don't need to focus on now, God confounded the language in verse 7 of Genesis chapter 11. And so he confounded their language by creating new languages. And the phenomenal thing, and we've got a quote there on the screen, which emphasizes to us through the Apostle Paul that God is in control of all the nations, the nation state boundaries, the points in time at which they exist, at which they don't exist, and so forth, that all these things are there to do with peoples and nations and languages, because, as we read in Acts 17 verse 27, that anybody that looks at this and thinks, well, why is it that things are the way they are, is to encourage them to seek the Lord. If haply they might search after him and find him, though he's not far from every one of us. And so this issue of language is a truly confounding problem, and it has been for centuries. And you can look at it on Wikipedia, you can look at it in academic journals, you can look at it more in the field of philosophy, and you can understand how philosophers have at times tried to talk about this, and that it was banned for philosophers to write any further arguments about why language should be, because it was such a controversial thing, because there's essentially no evidence whatsoever. And you see, one of the problems with language is that it's not evolutionary. There's no evidence to show that language is built off a common structure, off a common basis for how words are developed or for how peoples communicate. Languages from one country to another can bear no grammatical relation whatsoever. The construct of the language is totally foreign. That's why, for example, if you're trying to learn a language such as Farsi or Chinese, there's no point of commonality between the way the language is constructed and the way our spoken English language is constructed. There's nothing developmental there. They're totally separate and alien. And so again, it's interesting, if you're familiar with the Conversation, which is a really respected academic website and publication. You know, why do human beings speak so many languages was an article that was published in 2017. And it was interesting. I'm not going to go in any detail at all, but just a few words from it. You know, why is it that humans speak so many languages? Why are they so unevenly spread across the planet? As it turns out, we have few clear answers to these fundamental questions about how humanity communicates. Some ideas, as we've got at the bottom there, but little evidence. Nobody knows. Complete mystery that confounds the principle of evolution. But the Bible tells us God created multiple languages to ensure that humanity, through its weakness from the line of Cain, would not be able to get on with one another. And that's exactly what we see. When we think about distribution, here we're talking about the way in which the Bible message found its way into the world. How did it? Because when we look at the probability, at the context of when these, you know, when this historically happened at the time of Jesus, and then the apostles, we're told, who took the message of the gospel to the then known world, how on earth did it happen? Not like today, and even today, there's no message that's been promulgated from any source via any platform that's going to persist for the next 2,000 years. There's nothing that's promulgated from any platform at all that means that the world en masse are basing their lives on it. There's stuff that influences, there's stuff that informs opinion and debate and what truth is to people, but there's no law or set of rules or set of beliefs that's emerging from this time that people are basing their lives on. That's not the case with the Bible. And the man called Jesus lived in a place called Nazareth, and there was a population of between 200 to 600 people, depending on which historical source you read. It's the size of a hamlet. It's not even the size of a village in today's terms. Capernaum, population of 900 to 1,500 people. That's where Jesus based the centre of his preaching for 2.5 of his 3.5-year ministry. Messages escape from those tiny places to not just find its way into the minds of men and women throughout the whole earth in the time following Jesus. How is it that the Bible is still the best-selling book at a ratio of 8 to 1, more than that, but we'll call it 8 to 1 in the day and age in which we live? It's not possible, I would argue, unless God is in it. Don't forget also, we know from looking at the Gutenberg Bible that at the time of Jesus there were no books being published. There was no printed form of books. So when the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts, with a handful of others, and that's all it was, went to preach this message, gradually taking it into Europe, all they had were some teachings about a man who died and been raised from the dead, some rules for how to live, and telling people to eat a bit of bread and drink a drop of wine and get baptized in a bit of water as their instruments. And yet it took root in a way that nothing else ever has in the history of man's experience. When we look at the population of the world, and this is taken from United Nations data, so it's as robust as we can get, but we can see at the time of Jesus that there was a worldwide population of 300 million. We're currently tracking a trend that by 2030 there'll be 8.9 billion people on the earth. So we're talking about having 30 times the level of population that there was at Jesus' day. In Jesus' day, it's estimated that there were 0.6 people alive that have ever lived. And of those 0.6% of people that have ever lived, this was preached by Jesus to largely villages and towns with a population of less than 1,000 people. And yet here we are today talking about it. I'd argue that's a miracle. And then we come on to ourselves, human beings, finally. Romans tells us to be carnally minded is death, to be spiritually minded is life and peace. And there's so much overwhelming evidence now in the field of neuroscience that tells us that the unique ability of human beings to be spiritual, and it's unique, no other animal possesses that capability or capacity, to have a concept of something greater than oneself. It's good for our health. And so whilst we know that depression is something that's on the increase, it's interesting to understand that for the NHS, all of these recommendations were adopted. These recommendations were made by the Mental Health Foundation in 2016. They've all been fully adopted by the NHS, and when people approach the NHS with incidents of depression or mental health, you can read some of the recommendations on the right hand side there. The service users to be asked to be talk about their spiritual and religious needs, and to provide good access to relevant and appropriate religious and spiritual sources, to make available safe spaces where users can pray, and so on. Because the science behind it tells us that there's a correlation between the thickness of the cortical layer, and that is effectively the layer of the brain that's sort of on the outside of the brain, the outermost part of the brain. That has a thickness attributed to it, and the thicker that cortex, that cortical layer, the more likely we are to be spiritual. And there's correlation from numerous studies, not just these that I've got on the overhead there, but for example, if we read the words there from the research from Harvard in 2009, images of the right and left hemispheres of the brain as viewed from the side, the colours represent the differences in cortical thickness between the high risk group, which has depression, and the low risk group, which has no known risk. Blue and purple represent the thinning of the cortex, with purple regions having the greatest thinning. Green areas show no significant differences between the two groups. What told there, on the right hand side, individuals who reported they were highly spiritual or religious were far more likely to have a thicker brain cortex, that's the green, in certain areas than those who reported themselves to be non-spiritual. So science itself tells us that being spiritual is a good thing. It's healthy for our brains. And as the world becomes less knowledgeable about the Bible, as less people, fewer and fewer people attend church services, religious services, as we saw at the outset of the talk, then we can expect the incidence of depression to be higher based upon this science. And that's exactly what we see. So these numbers are from the NHS, and these tell us that the next iteration of this is being conducted now in 2021. It's done every 7 years, and we can see that the increase between 2000 and 2014 was pretty stark. Mental health issues, a third of people were touched by some form of mental health issue, and it'll be interesting to see what the data for 2021 says. So we've covered a number of different areas looking at the Bible, not specifically its content, although we focus a little bit on its story, but the power of some of its characteristics. It's unique as a publication. It's sold still in its droves. It's unique in its story. It's unique in its use of a nation called the nation of Israel to provide validation for the fact that the Jews are God's witnesses. It's unique in explaining the reason why human beings struggle so much with giving birth to children. It's unique in explaining why there are so many different languages that are unrelated in their grammatical structure and relationship to one another. It's unique in that it's a message that's persisted throughout human history, where no other message has in anything like the same way. And it comes from such small, humble beginnings, with so few people being preached to at the time of Jesus, and no means of communicating it on a global scale. And so the Bible encourages us to redeem our time. It says time is the gift, life is the gift that we each have. God's not willing that any of us should perish, but we have to search for him and he will be found. But he demands of his creation effort, because he wants that voluntary effort. He delights in it. It's why he's gifted free will. And so Ecclesiastes 9 verse 12 tells us that we don't know our time. We don't know when our time will be up. Psalm 90, written by Moses, says that, we live for 70 years, and if we're fortunate, we might live for 80 or so years. But Moses says, apply our hearts to wisdom, not to vanity. And Isaiah 42 asks the question for all of us, based upon what I would argue are pretty interesting facts that at least merit your time in looking into these things. Who among you will give ear to this, says Isaiah? Who will listen and hear for the time to come, which is the coming of God's kingdom? Thanks for listening.